I'm going to say something that makes people uncomfortable. Men aren't walking away from marriage because they're afraid of love. They're walking away because they've learned how to read contracts. For decades, men were told that marriage was the ultimate proof of maturity, of success, of being a real man. But now men in their 30s, 40s, and 50s are doing something different. They're not rebelling. They're calculating, quietly, carefully. And the numbers don't lie. They've watched their friends lose half of everything they built. They've watched fathers age in courtrooms instead of homes. They've watched marriages survive on paper while dying in real life. And they're asking a question no one wants to answer honestly. What exactly am I being asked to risk, and for what return? This isn't anger. It isn't bitterness. It's clarity. If this perspective already feels familiar, stay with me. What follows isn't an attack on love, women, or commitment. It's an examination of a system that no longer makes sense for men who have something to lose. Before we go further, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. And if you value calm, unfiltered conversations like this, consider subscribing. I started noticing the pattern long before it became a headline. Men I knew, men I respected, men who had done everything right, careers established, finances stable, lives that looked complete from the outside. And yet, one by one, they were quietly stepping away from marriage. Not loudly, not with speeches or resentment. Just a simple decision, no contract. These weren't men who couldn't attract partners. That excuse didn't survive 5 minutes of honest observation. They were dating. Some were in long-term relationships. Some had children. Some were deeply in love. What they were refusing wasn't intimacy. It was legal exposure. Whenever this topic comes up, someone inevitably throws out a number 56%. The divorce rate. It's presented like a warning, but it's also a comfort. A number low enough to preserve hope. A number that lets people believe they'll probably be fine. But that number is incomplete. It only counts marriages that officially end. It doesn't count the ones that should have. When you widen the lens, the picture changes. When you include couples who stay together for the kids, for the mortgage, for the health insurance, for the simple terror of starting over at 50, the failure rate climbs fast. 70%. Maybe 75. 3 out of 4 marriages are either dead or slowly dying, not in theory, in practice. I've sat across tables from men who haven't slept in the same bed as their wives in years. Men who count the days until their youngest child turns 18. Men who refer to their own homes as places they avoid. These men aren't in divorce statistics, but they're casualties all the same. And other men see this. They see it clearly. They don't need academic studies or viral clips. They have front row seats. Friends who used to laugh easily now speak in clipped sentences. Fathers who once coached Little League now see their kids every other weekend. Men who built something from nothing, now starting over with half a life and all the responsibility. This is where the narrative breaks down. People want to believe men are rejecting marriage because they're immature, afraid of responsibility, addicted to freedom. That story feels good because it protects the institution. It keeps the blame personal instead of structural. But it doesn't survive contact with reality. The men walking away are often the most disciplined ones. The ones who understand risk. The ones who didn't build their lives by signing documents they didn't read. They've watched what happens in family court. They've seen how quickly decades of effort can be dismantled by a judge who doesn't know them, doesn't care about context, and is bound by laws that change without warning. They've watched their fathers work themselves into early graves to support families they were legally separated from. They've watched men pay for households they're not allowed to live in. They've watched the quiet humiliation of asking permission to see their own children. And they're doing something radical. They're learning from other people's mistakes. This isn't hatred toward women. That accusation is lazy. Most of these men love women deeply. They date them. They build relationships. They share their lives. What they don't do anymore is confuse love with leverage. They don't confuse affection with contracts enforced by the state. The decision usually comes after a calculation, a simple one. Take what I've built. Cut it in half. That's the best case scenario if things go wrong. Then add legal fees. Add alimony. Add child support. Add the loss of daily access to my children. Add the emotional cost, the lost focus, the years of recovery, the permanent financial drag. Then compare that to what marriage actually adds in modern life. Sex that's available without marriage. Companionship, same. Children increasingly possible without legal entanglement. Social acceptance. Society moved on. Career advancement no longer tied to marital status. When you strip it down, the math becomes uncomfortable. And men who live by logic notice uncomfortable math. I remember one conversation vividly. A friend of mine, early 40s, sold his company for 7 figures. Never married. In a committed relationship for years. When I asked him why he wouldn't formalize it, he didn't rant. He didn't sound angry. He simply said, "I can't justify the downside." That was it. No bitterness, no ideology, just assessment. And that's what scares people. Because you can argue with anger, you can dismiss resentment, but you can't easily shame clarity. When someone calmly explains that the risk-to-reward ratio is catastrophically imbalanced, the usual scripts fail. Men aren't avoiding marriage because they're broken. They're avoiding it because they're paying attention. They see that the rules aren't symmetrical. They see that the incentives aren't aligned. They see that once you sign, the leverage shifts permanently. And they see that the system doesn't require malice to cause destruction. It only requires change. Change in feelings, change in law, change in circumstance. No one enters marriage planning to fail. But planning to succeed without acknowledging failure is not optimism, it's denial. What's happening now isn't rebellion, it's adaptation. Men are responding to incentives the same way humans always have. When the cost of participation rises and the benefits erode, participation drops. This isn't ideological, it's economic, it's behavioral. And that's why the shift feels so quiet. No marches, no slogans. Just men choosing not to sign. Choosing not to play a game where the rules can be rewritten mid-match. Choosing not to gamble decades of effort on the assumption that nothing will ever change. Because they've watched change destroy people they care about. This is the reality behind the statistics. Not the sanitized version, not the comforting averages. The lived reality. And once you see it, once you really see it, it's difficult to unsee. The question stops being, why won't men marry, and becomes something far more unsettling. Why would they? There's a statistic that should end the conversation immediately, but somehow it never does. 86% of divorced people remarry within 5 years. 86. Sit with that for a moment. These are people who didn't just fail at marriage. They went through the full experience, the emotional collapse, the financial damage, the legal warfare, the reshuffling of children between homes, the nights staring at ceilings, wondering how everything unraveled so completely. And then they do it again. This is where the psychology becomes uncomfortable because logic alone can't explain it. If someone touches a hot stove and gets burned, they don't usually reach out again and say, "This time it'll be different." But that's exactly what happens here. Over and over, with confidence, with conviction. Every remarriage is justified with the same sentence, the most expensive sentence in modern relationships. This time it's different. Different partner, different story, different hope, same contract. I've listened to men say this with a straight face after losing half their assets and daily access to their children. I've heard women say it after years of resentment and legal chaos. They speak as if the problem was a glitch, bad luck, a rare exception, not the structure itself. It's eerily similar to addiction. Abuse victims returning to their abusers, convinced they've learned enough to control the outcome this time. Gamblers walking back into casinos after catastrophic losses, telling themselves they're smarter now. That the system won't catch them twice. But systems don't care about personal growth. They care about probabilities. What people refuse to accept is that marriage failure is not always the result of bad choices or bad people. Often it's the natural outcome of placing lifelong legal and financial consequences on something as volatile as human emotion. Feelings change. People evolve. Circumstances shift. And yet the contract assumes stability that doesn't exist. When men look at the remarriage statistic, something clicks. If divorce were truly an anomaly, people would flee from it. If the experience were clearly educational behavior, would change. But behavior doesn't change. It repeats. That tells you the issue isn't individual ignorance. It's systemic reinforcement. Society doesn't just allow remarriage, it celebrates it. Second weddings are framed as redemption arcs, proof of resilience, proof that love wins if you just try again. No one asks the harder question. Why are we encouraging people to re-enter a system with such a high probability of damage without changing the rules? The answer is simple. Because questioning the system threatens too many narratives. Marriage is sold as a moral achievement. Divorce is treated as a personal failure. The framing keeps the institution clean while pushing responsibility downward. If it fails, it's your fault. You chose wrong. You didn't try hard enough. You didn't communicate. You didn't grow. But if the failure rate is approaching 75%, when you include the Walking Dead marriages, blaming individuals starts to look absurd. At that point, you're not dealing with outliers. You're dealing with design flaws. Men see this pattern clearly because they pay the price more visibly. They see friends remarry and repeat the same cycle. New optimism, new vows, new promises. Then the same slow erosion, the same legal threats whispered during arguments, the same realization that love and leverage don't mix well. What's striking is how calm the men who opt out tend to be. They're not ranting online. They're not campaigning against marriage. They're just not participating. They've watched enough rounds to understand the odds. This is where the conversation usually derails. Someone will say, "So what, you're just supposed to give up on love?" That's a false framing. Men aren't giving up on love. They're giving up on a specific legal mechanism attached to it. They're separating the emotion from the enforcement. The paradox is that remarriage proves the point. If love alone were enough, the first marriage would have survived. If experience truly fixed the problem, the second one wouldn't follow the same trajectory. But it often does, because the variables that matter most aren't personality traits. They're incentives laws and power dynamics. The contract doesn't change because you're wiser. The courts don't soften because you learned a lesson. The financial exposure doesn't shrink because you promised to do better. The system resets with a new signature and the same risks. Men notice this because they're the ones expected to bet upward. The more you have, the more you lose. A man with nothing can marry recklessly. A man with assets cannot. For him, love isn't just emotional vulnerability. It's financial exposure with asymmetric consequences. This is why the phrase, "this time, it's different," sounds so hollow to men who've done the math. Different feelings don't override identical terms. A different partner doesn't change the jurisdiction. A stronger bond doesn't nullify laws that can be rewritten while you're still married. What's really happening is this. People remarry because they're trying to recreate a feeling, not solve a problem. They want the early stage intoxication back. The validation, the sense of being chosen. They confuse that chemical high with structural compatibility. And the system rewards that confusion by packaging it as romance. Men who step back see the pattern clearly. Initial euphoria, gradual normalization, rising expectations, shifting power, legal leverage appearing when conflict emerges. Then either divorce or silent endurance. The ones who remarry are not stupid. They're hopeful. And hope, when disconnected from reality, becomes dangerous. It convinces intelligent people to ignore patterns they'd never ignore in business, health, or finance. If an investment lost 70% of the time, no one would recommend doubling down after a loss. If a medication failed, most patients, it would be pulled from the market. But marriage is protected by mythology, so instead of redesigning it, we shame people who question it. Men aren't immune to that mythology. They're just waking up to its cost. And once you see remarriage not as proof of love's endurance, but as evidence of systemic denial, the conversation shifts. The problem stops being commitment. The problem becomes repetition without reform. Men aren't afraid of trying again. They're afraid of repeating the same mistake under the same rules and expecting a different outcome. That's not fear. That's pattern recognition. None of this happens in a vacuum. Men don't arrive at these conclusions in isolation. They are pushed, shaped, and conditioned long before they ever sign a marriage license. The pressure doesn't begin in adulthood. It starts early, quietly, repeatedly. And by the time a man is old enough to question it, the programming is already deep. From childhood, the message is consistent. Marriage equals success, stability, completion. A man without a wife is treated as unfinished, regardless of what he builds or achieves. The bachelor is tolerated in his 20s, questioned in his 30s, pitied in his 40s, and pathologized beyond that. Not openly, not always with words, but with looks, jokes, and assumptions. Your mother asks when you're going to settle down, not if you want to. When? Family gatherings turn into interrogations disguised as concern. Friends announce engagements like milestones in a race everyone is expected to run. And every time you're not on that track, you're subtly reminded. Culture reinforces it. Movies end at weddings not 20 years later. The kiss, the ring, the applause fade to black before the compromises begin. Love stories never linger on family court or alimony schedules. They stop at the illusion because the illusion is easier to sell. Social media amplifies it. Perfectly staged wedding photos, anniversary posts curated like trophies, public declarations of happiness that say nothing about private reality. You're shown the highlight reel, never the unedited footage. And men absorb this even when they think they're immune. Biology plays its part too. Humans are wired to pair bond, to seek connection, to avoid isolation. That instinct once served survival. Today it's exploited by narratives that conflate companionship with contracts. Desire is leveraged into obligation, attachment into exposure. So men grow up believing that refusing marriage is refusing adulthood itself, that hesitation is immaturity, that caution is cowardice. And for a long time they comply. They follow the script because questioning it feels like questioning their own worth. What's changing now is not biology, it's perspective. Men are breaking the spell not because they've become cynical, but because they've become observant. They're watching outcomes instead of listening to promises. They're comparing the story they were told with the lives they see around them. And the mismatch is impossible to ignore. The man who did everything right but now sees his kids twice a week. The man who stayed loyal for decades and is still paying for a marriage that ended years ago. The man who never left but feels lonelier inside his own home than he ever did alone. These aren't fringe cases. They're common. Once you notice this, the pressure tactics start to look hollow. Calling men afraid doesn't work when the men opting out are often the most responsible ones in the room. Shaming them as selfish fails when they're the ones supporting extended families, building businesses, and creating stability without asking for validation. There's a deeper psychological shift happening. Men are learning to separate identity from compliance. They're realizing that being a good man doesn't require signing every contract society puts in front of them. That maturity isn't obedience, it's discernment. This is why the conversation becomes emotional so quickly. When someone challenges marriage, they're not just questioning a lifestyle choice. They're challenging a shared belief system, a collective agreement that props up social order. And systems don't like being examined. The fear beneath the outrage is simple. If men stop participating, the illusion collapses. If men openly acknowledge that the institution no longer serves them, the moral high ground erodes. Marriage stops being a badge of virtue and starts looking like a negotiated risk. That terrifies people who built their identities around it. So instead of asking whether men's concerns are valid, society defaults to character attacks. They're damaged. They're commitment phobic. They're emotionally stunted. These labels are easier than confronting structural imbalance. But men feel the dissonance. They feel it when they're told marriage is about love, then threatened with financial consequences when love falters. They feel it when vows about partnership coexist with laws that reward conflict. They feel it when the romantic narrative demands blind trust in a system that punishes trust. At some point, the conditioning breaks. Not dramatically, not all at once. Usually through accumulation. One divorce story, then another, then a third. A quiet realization that the risks aren't hypothetical. They're documented. This is when men begin to reframe marriage not as destiny, but as a choice. One option among many. Not the finish line of life, but a path with specific costs and constraints. And once you see it that way, the pressure loses its power. The fear of being judged fades when you realize judgment doesn't pay your legal fees. Social approval doesn't rebuild assets. Applause doesn't guarantee access to your children. The rewards society offers for compliance are symbolic. The penalties for failure are material. Men start asking questions they were never encouraged to ask. What happens if this ends? Who decides? Who benefits? Who pays? These aren't unromantic questions. They're adult ones. And the moment a man starts viewing marriage through adult eyes, instead of inherited fantasies, the calculus changes. He stops seeing refusal as failure. He starts seeing it as restraint. This doesn't mean men stop loving. If anything, they become more deliberate. They invest emotionally where they aren't legally exposed. They choose relationships that are voluntary, not enforced. They seek connection without surrendering control of their future. The programming told men that marriage was proof of worth. Reality teaches them that worth doesn't need proof. It needs protection. That's the quiet shift happening now. Not rebellion, not bitterness, awareness. And once awareness sets in, the old pressure stops working. Once men step outside, the emotional framing marriage starts to look very different. Strip away the ceremony, the music, the vows spoken in front of smiling faces. What remains is not poetry. It's paperwork. A legally binding contract enforced by the state with consequences that extend far beyond the relationship itself. This is where the discomfort really begins, because most people have never been encouraged to think of marriage this way. Fitam, they're told it's about love, unity, and shared dreams. They're not told it's about jurisdiction statutes and precedent. They're not told that the most powerful party in their marriage will eventually be neither of them, but the legal system standing behind the contract. When men examine marriage through this lens, the comparison becomes unavoidable. In every other area of life, contracts are treated with caution. You read the terms. You assess the downside. You negotiate protections. You assume that circumstances will change because they always do. Yet marriage is treated as the one agreement where logic is suspended in favor of faith. Imagine approaching a business deal this way, betting half your net worth and a percentage of your future income on the assumption that emotions will never shift, that stress will never accumulate, that two people will remain aligned forever. No rational person would do this, not because they lack optimism, but because they respect uncertainty. Marriage demands the opposite. It demands certainty where none exists. Men begin to realize that they are being asked to insure against nothing while exposing themselves to everything. If the relationship thrives, the rewards are mutual but limited. If it fails, the penalties are severe and often one-sided. This asymmetry is what breaks the spell. The uncomfortable truth is that marriage is the only major contract most men will ever sign where the terms can be changed after the fact. Tax laws evolve. Alimony rules shift. Custody standards are reinterpreted. The agreement you sign today is not the agreement you'll be bound by tomorrow. And you consent to that uncertainty the moment you sign. No one explains this at the altar. No one pauses the ceremony to say, by the way, the state reserves the right to redefine your obligations at any time. Instead, men are encouraged to think about the honeymoon, not the horizon. Once this becomes clear, the romantic narrative collapses. Not because romance is fake, but because it's incomplete. Love explains why people come together. It doesn't explain why one party should assume disproportionate risk if things fall apart. Men don't object to sharing. They object to exposure without consent. They object to agreements where exit terms are deliberately vague and enforcement is aggressive. They object to being told that questioning this arrangement makes them unloving. The more disciplined a man is, the harder this is to ignore. Men who've built wealth understand downside risk. Men who've built companies understand liability. Men who've built stability understand how fragile it can be when incentives misalign. Marriage viewed honestly concentrates risk instead of distributing it. This is why the phrase betting on love rings hollow. Betting implies odds. It implies a payout structure. It implies a house that always wins. In modern marriage, the house is the legal system, and it profits regardless of outcome. Men begin asking a question no one wants to answer directly. If marriage is truly about partnership, why does the law treat separation like a zero-sum battle? If it's about unity, why does conflict become financially incentivized the moment things deteriorate? These aren't philosophical questions. They're practical ones, and practical questions demand practical answers. When you examine marriage without sentiment, you see that it's less a celebration of love and more a transfer of control. Control over assets, over time, over access to children, over future decisions. And once control is transferred, reclaiming it becomes expensive, slow, and uncertain. This doesn't mean men reject commitment. It means they reject blind commitment. They want relationships where cooperation is chosen, not enforced. Where staying together is a daily decision, not a legal trap. The irony is that this perspective doesn't cheapen love. It clarifies it. Love becomes something you give freely, not something you mortgage your future to secure. Commitment becomes meaningful precisely because it's voluntary. Marriage, as currently structured, undermines that. It replaces choice with consequence. It replaces desire with obligation. And men feel that shift long before the paperwork ever matters. They feel it when disagreements escalate into threats, when emotional distance suddenly carries legal weight, when love becomes leverage. At that point, the contract reveals its true function. It's not there to protect the relationship. It's there to manage its failure. Men who understand contracts understand this immediately. You don't design agreements for ideal conditions. You design them for when things go wrong. And when men read the fine print of marriage, they see that the worst-case scenario is not only possible, it's statistically likely. That realization doesn't make them cold. It makes them careful. They start to see marriage not as a natural step forward, but as a calculated risk with diminishing returns. They ask whether the upside justifies the exposure. And for many, the answer is no. This is where the conversation shifts from emotion to structure, from romance to reality, from what marriage promises to what it enforces. And once enforcement becomes visible, belief alone is no longer enough to sustain participation. This is the point where the discussion usually derails. The moment money enters the conversation, defenses go up. Voices get louder, accusations appear. Gold digger, cynic, misogynist, as if acknowledging economics somehow contaminates love. As if pretending money doesn't matter has ever protected anyone from losing it. That reaction itself is revealing. Every relationship is an exchange of value. Every single one. Time, attention, loyalty, support, status, security, intimacy. These things are not abstract. They are scarce. They are traded consciously or not. Pretending otherwise doesn't make a relationship purer. It makes it dishonest. The childish version of this debate focuses on extremes. The caricature of a woman only interested in money. The fantasy of love existing in a vacuum, untouched by material reality. Both are distractions. The truth sits in the middle, and it's far less dramatic. Consider the example people love to whisper about. An older, wealthy man with a younger, beautiful woman. Society points scoffs and declares the verdict immediately. Transactional, shallow, exploitative. But what's often missing from that judgment is the clarity of the arrangement. He brings resources, experience, stability. She brings youth, beauty, energy. Both understand the trade. Both consent. There is more honesty in that dynamic than in many conventional marriages where people insist money doesn't matter while quietly resenting each other over it. Where financial contributions are tracked mentally but never discussed openly. Where expectations are implied instead of negotiated. The problem isn't exchange. The problem is denial. Men don't get destroyed because women consider resources. That's rational behavior. Strategic behavior. Throughout history, it always has been. Feelings fluctuate. Circumstances change. Bills arrive on schedule. Children need support whether love is present or not. Anyone who understands this isn't cynical. They're realistic. What destroys men is believing the performance instead of recognizing the transaction. Believing that money plays no role. Believing that love alone determines outcomes. Believing that economics somehow dissolve once vows are spoken. That belief doesn't protect anyone. It sets them up. At least explicit transactions are honest. You know what's being exchanged. You know the terms. You know when the exchange ends. Marriage, on the other hand, insists it's about love while structuring itself around resources. That mismatch is where the damage happens. Here's the uncomfortable part. Women on average understand this better than men. Not because they're manipulative, but because they're socialized to think long-term. Security matters. Stability matters. Provision matters. That doesn't make affection fake. It makes it contextual. Love has always been both emotional and economic. Always. The idea that romance exists independently of material reality is new, fragile, and historically naive. For most of human history, marriage was not a love story. It was a survival strategy, a way to align families' resources and futures. Love marriages are a modern invention, barely a century old. And they emerged in a very specific context: rising wealth, social safety nets, and the illusion that individual happiness could replace collective stability. We're now watching the limits of that experiment. When you mix intense emotion with long-term financial obligation and then pretend the financial side doesn't exist, someone pays. In modern systems, that someone is usually the man with assets. This doesn't mean women are villains. It means incentives matter. When the law guarantees financial support regardless of behavior when exit costs are asymmetrical, rational actors respond accordingly, not maliciously. Predictably, men are late to this realization because they were taught to equate provision with virtue, to prove love through sacrifice, to ignore risk in the name of romance. And for a long time, that script worked well enough to keep them compliant. But reality has a way of asserting itself. When marriages fail, the language of love disappears instantly. What remains is accounting, income statements, asset division, custody schedules. At that stage, pretending money never mattered becomes absurd. It mattered enough to destroy lives. Men start asking why this wasn't discussed honestly at the beginning. Why acknowledging economics was framed as unromantic. Why realism was treated as betrayal. And the answer is uncomfortable. Because honesty threatens the fantasy. The fantasy says love conquers all. The reality says love doesn't pay alimony. The fantasy says trust completely. The reality says the system punishes trust without protection. The fantasy says feelings are enough. The reality says feelings expire. Once men accept that relationships involve exchange, they stop being offended by it. They stop moralizing it. They simply want it acknowledged, defined, balanced. They want agreements that reflect reality, not poetry. They want partnerships where expectations are clear, contributions are understood, and exit doesn't mean annihilation. This is why conversations about money matter more than declarations of love. Money reveals priorities. It exposes assumptions. It forces clarity. Couples who can't discuss it calmly aren't failing at romance. They're failing at adulthood. Men who recognize this aren't reducing relationships to economics. They're refusing to let economics hide behind romance. They're insisting that if resources are involved, honesty must be too. The tragedy isn't that marriage involves money. The tragedy is pretending it doesn't right up until it destroys people who believe the lie. Men are no longer willing to play along with that fiction. Not because they're cold, but because they've seen where it leads. When you step back far enough, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. For most of human history, marriage was not a romantic fantasy. It was a practical institution, economic, strategic, designed to stabilize families' pool resources and ensure survival across generations. Love, when it appeared, was a bonus, not the foundation. Our ancestors understood something modern culture prefers to forget. When you bind finances, labor, and children together, emotions alone are not a reliable anchor. Feelings change faster than obligations. Desire fades faster than responsibility. And pretending otherwise doesn't make it noble. It makes it fragile. The idea of marrying primarily for love is a recent experiment. Barely 100 years old, it emerged alongside industrialization, individualism, and the belief that personal happiness should override collective stability. For a while, it worked well enough. There was margin for error. One income could support a household. Divorce was rare, stigmatized, and financially impractical. The system enforced endurance. That world no longer exists. Modern marriage kept the emotional framing but stripped away the structural safeguards. It told people to follow their feelings while attaching lifelong legal consequences to those feelings. It encouraged passion without preparing for entropy. And entropy always arrives. This is where men start to feel the imbalance most acutely. They were taught to believe that providing was love, that sacrifice was virtue, that protecting others was proof of masculinity, and for generations that expectation made sense within a stable framework. Roles were clear, contributions were understood, the exchange was explicit even if unspoken. Today the expectations remain, but the framework is gone. Men are still expected to provide stability, but stability itself is no longer reciprocal. They're still expected to commit fully, but commitment is now enforceable only in one direction. They're still expected to risk everything while being told risk shouldn't even be acknowledged. This contradiction is at the heart of modern marriage's failure. When men begin to question it, they're often told they're nostalgic, that they want to return to outdated gender roles, that they can't handle equality. But this misses the point entirely. The issue isn't equality, it's asymmetry. True equality requires symmetry of risk, symmetry of consequence, symmetry of accountability. Without that, what's being offered isn't partnership, it's exposure. Historically, marriage worked because it was honest about its nature. It didn't pretend to be purely emotional. It acknowledged economics openly. Families negotiated terms. Dowries existed. Property rights were defined. Expectations were set before vows were spoken. The romance came later, if it came at all. Modern marriage does the opposite. It sells romance up front and hides the economics in fine print. It celebrates feelings and suppresses questions. And when the questions finally surface, usually during conflict, they're treated as betrayal. Men feel this betrayal sharply because they're often the last to realize what they agreed to. They entered expecting partnership and discovered governance. They expected collaboration and found regulation. This doesn't mean the past was ideal. It means it was honest in ways the present is not. The modern narrative says love should be unconditional. but the legal system enforces conditions ruthlessly. It says commitment should be forever, but exit is incentivized through conflict. It says trust fully, but punishes those who do. Men who understand history see the problem clearly. We took an institution built on economics, stripped away its explicit negotiations, layered it with romantic mythology, and then acted surprised when it collapses under pressure. When people say, our ancestors weren't very romantic, they're right. They were realistic. They understood that survival requires planning, not fantasy. That feelings are volatile. That binding lives together requires more than chemistry. Men today aren't rejecting romance. They're rejecting the lie that romance alone is enough to sustain a legal and financial partnership for decades. They're rejecting the idea that acknowledging reality is cynical. What's often framed as emotional coldness is actually historical literacy. Men look at the data. They look at outcomes. They look at the lived experience of those who came before them. And they notice that the system no longer rewards responsibility the way it once did. It penalizes it. A man with nothing to lose can enter modern marriage with minimal risk. A man with assets cannot. That alone tells you the institution is misaligned. When the most productive members of a society avoid a system designed to stabilize families, something is fundamentally wrong. This is why you see successful men opting out at higher rates. Not because they fear commitment, but because they understand exposure. They've learned that building something valuable attracts not just admiration, but liability. The tragedy is that this realization often comes too late. After the wedding, after the contracts, after the laws have jurisdiction. At that point, history lessons are useless. The machine is already in motion. But for men watching from the outside, history is a warning. It shows them that institutions evolve, that what worked under one set of incentives fails under another, and that loyalty to outdated models isn't virtue, it's stubbornness. Modern marriage asks men to ignore centuries of practical wisdom and replace it with faith. Faith that love will override incentives. Faith that laws will remain static. Faith that power will always be exercised fairly. Men who've built anything meaningful know better than to rely on faith alone. They don't deny love. They contextualize it. They don't deny commitment. They define it. They don't deny partnership. They insist on balance. And when balance isn't available, they walk away. Not in anger, not in protest, but with the quiet certainty of someone who understands that repeating a failed design doesn't make it noble. It makes it reckless. Get hook fan by tiep tu kieu kau vietju moten hin gen moten hin haitram tu teo qui gen fantam. There is one word that exposes how fragile the fantasy really is. Prenup. Say it out loud and watch the reaction change. The air shifts. The smiles tighten. Suddenly love is questioned. Trust is challenged. Romance is declared dead on arrival. All from a single request to define boundaries before consequences exist. That response alone tells you everything you need to know. A prenuptial agreement isn't planning for divorce. It's acknowledging reality. Marriage is not one thing. It is three things happening at the same time. A personal bond, a social ritual, and a legal contract with the state. Most people only prepare for the first two. The third one is signed blindly. The spiritual side is private. That's between you and whatever you believe in. The social side is performative. The celebration, the recognition, the photos. But the legal side is permanent and enforceable. It doesn't care about intention. It doesn't care about love. It only cares about compliance. Most men sign this contract without reading it. They're standing in rented suits, focused on the moment, unaware that they are transferring control over their financial future to a system that can change its rules at any time. Tax laws shift, alimony standards evolve, custody definitions are reinterpreted, and none of this requires your consent after the fact. The contract you sign today is not the contract you will be bound by 10 years from now. A prenup is simply saying we will define our own terms instead of outsourcing them to the state. We will decide what happens if things change, instead of letting strangers decide during the most emotionally volatile period of our lives. That should be considered responsible. Instead, it's treated as offensive. Why? Because it punctures the illusion that love alone is enough. Because it forces conversations people would rather postpone until it's too late. Because it introduces adulthood into a space dominated by fantasy. The basic structure of a fair prenup is simple. What I bring in is mine. What you bring in is yours. What we build together, we share. Clear, clean, balanced. No ambushes. No retroactive claims. No financial warfare disguised as justice. And yet, even this is often rejected. People would rather sign a blank check to the government than have an uncomfortable conversation with the person they claim to trust most. They would rather risk everything than admit that forever is not guaranteed. That feelings can fade. That circumstances can change. This resistance isn't logical. It's emotional. It comes from the fear that acknowledging risk somehow causes failure, that protecting yourself signals doubt, that realism undermines romance. But we don't apply this logic anywhere else in life. You buy life insurance without planning to die. You wear a seatbelt without planning to crash. You save money without planning to lose your job. Planning for worst-case scenarios isn't pessimism. It's competence. A prenup is no different. Except this time, the risk you're insuring against has a failure rate approaching 75%. That's not paranoia. That's statistical awareness. What a prenup actually does is force clarity early. It asks questions most couples avoid. How will we handle money? What happens if one of us stops working? What if someone inherits wealth? What if one of us starts a business? What if we grow apart? These questions don't weaken relationships. Avoiding them does. Couples who can't discuss these topics calmly aren't deeply romantic. They're unprepared. They're relying on chemistry to carry them through decades of logistical reality. That's not love. That's gambling. Men who push for prenups aren't planning to leave. They're planning to stay without fear. They're trying to remove coercion from commitment. Because commitment that exists only due to financial entanglement isn't commitment. It's captivity. Here's the paradox people miss. Prenups don't kill romance. They enhance it. When both parties are protected, something shifts. You stay because you want to, not because you have to. You choose each other freely, not under threat of legal or financial destruction. Every day becomes a decision, not an obligation. That's real intimacy. Knowing someone could leave easily and chooses not to. Knowing you could walk away and don't want to. That's commitment with integrity. A good prenup protects dignity. On both sides. It says if this ends, we won't destroy each other. It says I respect you enough to ensure that even in conflict, we remain fair. It says we are equals entering this partnership, and we will leave as equals if it dissolves. That isn't planning for failure. It's respecting each other enough to plan for reality. Most resistance to prenups comes from ego, not love. From the belief that acknowledging risk diminishes uniqueness. that statistics apply to other people, not us. That our story is exempt from probability. Everyone believes they're the exception. No one believes they're the rule. But mathematics doesn't care about love stories. Probability doesn't bend for vows. And courts don't enforce intentions. They enforce contracts. Men who understand this aren't cynical. They're literate. They read what they sign. They ask questions before consequences arrive. They refuse to confuse romance with risk management. If a couple can't survive a conversation about money and contingencies, they won't survive decades of shared life. A prenup doesn't create distrust. It reveals whether trust is grounded in reality or fantasy. The irony is that the healthiest marriages are often the ones that can discuss exit calmly. Not because they expect it, but because they aren't afraid of it. They know staying is a choice, not a trap. Men aren't asking for guarantees. They're asking for fairness. They're asking not to be punished for planning responsibly. They're asking to love without surrendering control of their future to a system that profits from failure. And the fact that this request is still treated as heresy tells you how far removed modern marriage has become from adult reasoning. There is a category of men no statistic wants to acknowledge. They don't appear in divorce rates. They don't post angry messages online. They don't announce their suffering. They simply endure, quietly, invisibly, and they are everywhere. These are the men who stayed. They stayed not because the marriage worked, but because leaving would have meant financial suicide. Because walking away would have cost them their children, their home, their retirement, their future. Because the exit price was so high that staying felt like the only rational option, even as it slowly hollowed them out. You can recognize them once you know what to look for. The man who works late every night, not out of ambition, but because going home feels like stepping into a prison. The husband who volunteers for every business trip, every overtime shift, every excuse to delay returning to a house that no longer feels like his. The father who is physically present but emotionally absent, conserving energy just to survive the day. These men are praised by society. They are called responsible, stable, committed. They are held up as examples of what real men do. They kept the family together. They didn't abandon their responsibilities. What society doesn't see is the cost. They signed up for partnership and found themselves trapped in obligation. They expected intimacy and received indifference. They hoped for cooperation and encountered control. And when they realized the reality, it was already too late to leave without losing everything. So they stay. They stay for the kids, telling themselves it's noble even as the household becomes a cold war zone where tension replaces warmth. They stay for the house because selling it would mean starting over at 45 with half the resources and double the stress. They stay because retirement is no longer a guarantee, and starting again would push it permanently out of reach. This isn't commitment. It's captivity. Many of these men develop coping mechanisms. Some are socially acceptable. Working too much, becoming obsessed with fitness, immersing themselves in hobbies that keep them away from home. Others are more destructive. Alcohol, prescription drugs, affairs that provide temporary relief but deepen the trap. And then there are the men on antidepressants. Not because their brains are broken, but because their lives are. They are medicated into tolerating a situation that would make any healthy person feel despair. The system labels them depressed instead of acknowledging the environment itself is pathological. These men are not weak, they are constrained. What makes this especially cruel is that they are rarely counted as failures. On paper, they succeeded. Still married, still providing, still functioning. But internally, they are eroding. Day by day, year by year. Their dreams are the first casualties. Plans quietly abandoned. Ambitions scaled back. Risks no longer taken because stability must be preserved at all costs. They become careful to the point of paralysis, not because they lack courage, but because the margin for error is gone. This is the reality men see when they look at marriage beyond the wedding photos. Not just divorce, but living death. Not just separation, but prolonged entrapment. And other men notice. They notice that these marriages don't look like partnerships. They look like slow negotiations with no leverage. They notice that the men involved don't speak freely anymore, that they measure every word, that they've learned to avoid conflict, not to preserve love, but to avoid consequences. This is the part no one wants to talk about. Divorce statistics are uncomfortable. Dead marriages are worse, because they expose the lie that staying is always virtuous. Sometimes staying is simply the least damaging option available in a rigged system. Men aren't blind to this. They see the cost of endurance. They see what happens when a man ties his entire future to a legal arrangement he cannot exit without devastation. And they draw conclusions. The decision not to marry often isn't about fear of divorce. It's about fear of being trapped. Fear of becoming one of these men. Fear of waking up one day realizing that freedom disappeared years ago quietly with a signature. This is why lectures about commitment fall flat. These men are committed. Committed to protecting what they've built. Committed to avoiding irreversible mistakes. Committed to not handing over leverage they can never reclaim. The cruel irony is that many of the men who stay are praised for their masculinity, while the men who avoid the trap are shamed as immature. One group sacrifices their inner life to maintain appearances. The other refuses to sacrifice their future for validation. And the system rewards the first group with applause and the second with contempt. But applause doesn't rebuild a life. Approval doesn't restore autonomy. Respectability doesn't compensate for lost years. Men who stay in dead marriages are not winners. They are warnings. Warnings that marriage doesn't have to end in court to destroy a man. It can destroy him quietly, legally, respectably, with no scandal, no escape. Just obligation stretching into the horizon. Once men understand this, the question changes. It's no longer, what if it ends badly? It becomes, what if it never ends at all? What if the worst outcome isn't separation, but permanence without partnership? That possibility alone is enough to make rational men hesitate. Enough to make them read contracts carefully. Enough to make them refuse arrangements that remove their ability to choose. Because a life where leaving is impossible is not a life built on love. It's a life built on fear. And men are no longer willing to call that success. What all of this points to is a lesson that reaches far beyond marriage. The most dangerous decisions in life are not the emotional ones. They are the unexamined ones. The choices we make because everyone else made them. The paths we follow because questioning them feels uncomfortable. Many people don't lose their freedom in a dramatic moment. They sign it away quietly, believing that love, hope, or intention will somehow override reality. Real maturity is not about committing harder. It's about committing consciously. It's about understanding that love and responsibility are not enemies, but they are not the same thing. Love is a feeling. Responsibility is a structure. When you confuse the two, you build your life on something that cannot support weight. The goal is not to avoid relationships. It's to choose them without fear, to stay because you want to, not because you're trapped. To build partnerships where honesty exists before crisis, not after damage. The strongest bonds are not the ones that eliminate choice. They are the ones that survive because choice is always there. This applies to work, to money, to friendships, to identity itself. Any system that requires blindness to function will eventually punish those who trust it most. Any commitment that demands silence instead of clarity will extract a cost later. If this message resonated, I'd like to hear from you. Share your perspective in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what part of this felt closest to your own experience? And if you value calm, honest conversations about life, relationships, and the decisions that shape our future, consider subscribing. Not out of pressure, out of alignment.